Okay, so this session is focused around the legal and ethical concept of duty of care. Here it's thrown around a little. It's a key thing for you to know and understand and to work with. So by the end of this, you'll know a couple of different legal terms actually. Duty of care was only one. Negligence, duty of care, dignity of risk. Those are all key things to get your head around while we're working with our clients. They've all got legal, ethical and organisational elements to them, and we're going to play around, if time permits, with how to deal with those issues when they come up in the workplace. And you remember me saying, this is one of these things where there's certainly a little element to it, but there's also ethical and there's also organisational, and they back each other up, they support each other, and they reinforce each other, but they all have their own spaces as well. I'm going to begin with the fact that it's mentioned in your code of ethics, and it'll be mentioned in pretty much every code of ethics we ever look at, that we have a duty to support those around us. I'll explain the concept in a moment. And certainly it'll be a major part of just about every policy manual you'll ever look at. They might not use the exact words duty of care, but I'll explain the concept in a moment and we'll get some understanding. So there's once a decision made by a judge. This actually happened in England, but we've brought it into Australian law as well. It's a beautiful story. A woman went out to a cafe with her friend, and they had, like a ginger beer, and you put, or lemonade or something, and you put ice cream on top, and it all froths and goes to spider. You got it. So she had what she called an ice cream flat, a ginger beer, which interesting flavour, but nevertheless, she had her spider, put a straw in, sucked away down to the bottom of it, was enjoying it somewhat until the very last bit of the spider when she saw the remains of a snail. And she went, how you have to really work. Oh, yeah, you got it. That's right. It wasn't very nice. She felt a bit ill after this, psychologically and gastrointestinally. And she decided that she will sue Spain, suing on a separate occasion, but basically, if you've done wrong to me, then I can take that to court and say, you've done wrong to me, it's cost me money, and I'd like the money back, and the judge will decide, balance up whether that's accurate or not, and move from there. And what the judge said is, so remember this is a common law decision, because it's made by a judge, and it set the precedent for this to happen on other occasions. What the judge said is, everybody, you must take reasonable care to avoid acts or omissions that you could reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbour. That was his statement, and therefore that follows on for others. And I'll take you through that bit by bit. It started by saying, you must, basically all of us have a duty of care at some point of time. There's times when we could do something that we could reasonably predict is going to injure somebody. While we're talking about though, keep in mind the more power you've got in the relationship, the greater your responsibility to be watching out for other people's likelihood of being injured. He was careful with his words when he made the decision. He didn't say you have to take absolute care to make sure that there is no chance anybody ever gets injured. He used the reasonable, he said reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbour. He's put a few spaces in there that had to be tested in court later. So people started adding up, well, would a reasonable person have expected that there was a snail in their drink? Probably not. Would a reasonable person have taken responsibility themselves to make sure there's no snails in the bottom of their drink? the snail is the guy that, I'm assuming it's a guy, the person who sold her the drink didn't put the snail in there. The snail was already in the bottle when it left the bottle shop, hundreds of miles away. They had left the bottles outside because bottles get refilled in those days. The snail had found its way in. They made their ginger beer, they capped it, they'd sold it on to people. And they'd say, surely we're not responsible for everything that happens. We never even met this woman. What sort of responsibility do we have to her? So the court said, basically, they could reasonably predict that something could have happened. It's reasonable.
Snakes can actually really mess you up when you eat raw snails.
There's
a lot of nasties that can come from eating raw snails.
Yeah. When I was in Vietnam, the woman there was had big trays of lots and lots of snails. But they were all cooked. No.
Yes,
Chose not to eat them anyway.
Cooked snails are reasonably safe. Raw snails can kill you.
That's probably why they're not normally in milkshakes. Okay, one of many reasons. But yeah, that's right, they've got bad stuff in them. It's important for some people to know the legal technicalities. So when the court's deciding what is a reasonable standard of care, there's a bunch of precedents that have happened. It's already been tested several times. And they're going to look at how big the risk is, how likely it is, how expensive and inconvenient it would have been to avoid that risk, and any other conflicting responsibilities that the defendant, the person who's being sued, has got in that. So they would have had to add up how big a risk is it to have a snail in your milkshake anyway. It turns out a fairly big one. How likely is it? Do they need to test every last little thing? How expensive or difficult or inconvenient was it going to be to make sure that no slug-dead or snails ever got into their milkshake? Depending on who you ask, it's a slug or a snail. Doesn't make a big difference.
Wouldn't a snail be easier to notice? Wouldn't it be slightly crunchy?
It would, yes. An important part of it was that it's acts or omissions. So nobody actually took the snail and put it in the bottle. It was that they failed to make sure that the snails didn't get into the bottle. So they could have tried saying we didn't actually deliberately cause you harm. The court was saying here, don't really care, do it? It's an omission, it's a thing that you didn't do that was just as important. And finally, he said it's to injure your neighbour. And the judge was actually asked to clarify this. Okay, so who is my neighbour? Because this woman I never met. Was she my neighbour? She's hundreds of miles away. She's the end customer. If it caused damage to the person I sold to, then maybe. But I sold to a distributor who sold to a cafe, who sold to a woman having a milkshake. Is she really my neighbour? And the judge gave a very circular answer, in my opinion. He said, your neighbour is anybody who you should reasonably have in mind that might be affected by what you did. So basically it's, people try wheedling out of it. No, your neighbour is somebody who will be affected by whatever you did. So basically, you need to make sure, wherever possible, to not do stuff or not do stuff that you could reasonably predict is going to injure someone else, whether you know them or not, whether they're several chains down or not. You're known as being negligent if you fail to do what you should have done. Fail to do what? Yeah, I think that works. And if you want to get legalistic about it, and I know that sometimes, well, if it ever gets to court, they're going to want to get legalistic about it. They're going to want to determine, was this person owed a duty of care? Was this person actually the neighbour, the person you could reasonably predict was going to get injured? It's not a vital thing. For those who are writing notes, this is not vital, but it's there. Okay, were you my neighbour? Did I owe you a duty of care? Did I breach that duty of care? And did I, through breaching that duty of care, cause you some damage? If you can prove all three of those, then I'd be shown to be negligent. if I didn't actually owe you a duty of care, it doesn't matter that you were damaged by something. I didn't really owe you that duty of care anyway. If I owed you a duty of care but it didn't actually damage you, it just could have, then I haven't been negligent because it didn't actually cause you an injury. That's important to some people. I mentioned it there. What is more likely to come up is this concept of negligent misstatement. You're studying the law, your clients are going to expect you. They're going to say, you must want a Davis passes, you must know all about the law. You'll say very clever, he gave you a pass. Or maybe an EG. But nevertheless, they're going to expect that of you. If you were to give statements and it turns out that wasn't true, then it's what we call negligent misstatement. Giving wrong, gratuitous, so giving wrong advice, giving you advice just flippantly as if it didn't really matter, or careless advice. That then results in harm to the person it's given to. So an example would be if you gave them advice saying, yeah, 2 plants is fine, this is the ACT, you can grow that all you like, just, they never ever do anything. They only ever give you a ticket. Turns out to be false advice. They have the choice of giving you a ticket, or they have the choice of actually taking you to court. So giving that advice, if it caused them harm, negligent misstatement, bad move on your part. So you need to be careful what you advise people, because the wrong advice can be costly to your client and it can be costly to you because they can say you were negligent. And you owe a duty of care and it costs them money, therefore you've breached your duty of care. Is that making sense? So be careful with that. And that's why I suggested in an earlier session that rather than giving legal advice and looking it up too much, it's a great strategy for the legal reasons to sit down with your client and say, let's explore this together. It's a great reason for ethical purposes because it's actually empowering the client to look it up for themselves in future. It's showing them the websites, it's showing them how it goes, and you can explore that stuff together, looking it up that way. Okay, negligent misstatement. Good concept to know about. And people got a bit scared about being sued a few years back. Around about the turn of the century, there are a lot of high-profile cases of people being sued for causing damage to others and forking out millions of dollars. It caused a major crisis in our industry. There are lots of services closed saying, we can't afford the insurance anymore. It's too risky, too liable an industry. We just can't afford that. So, in every state pretty much in the country, they brought in civil liability legislation so that people are limited in how much they could be sued for damages if you're delivering a public service or a charitable activity, because the insurance really did blow out. It went from a couple of thousand to 25,000 in one service I know about. And in the ACT version, it protects Good Samaritans. I'm going to pause for a moment there. How many people have heard stories about somebody being sued that just seem so outrageously stupid? Can you remember the details of what was happening?
Oh, I actually just read it in one of Joe Pickett's books.
Right.
Other people have read it, but someone like smoked 10 cigars or something. He had them short, and then I don't know, he sued or something for like a fire.
Okay. There's a lot of stories you'll hear from time to time, and especially around that time when there's the lobbying for these laws to come in. You may have heard about the man who was stealing somebody's tyre or stealing somebody's hubcap, and as the owner of the car drove off, he drove over their fingers, and the thieves then sued the car owner for the damage done to him while he's trying to steal stuff. You may have heard there was one last year, somebody sued Red Bull because it didn't really give them wings. You may have heard about the woman who was driving her Winnebago, which is like a drive itself. She then got up, went into the back of the vehicle. It drove off the road, and she sued Ford for their vehicle not being cleared at cruise control and drive itself. There's 100 of these stories that you hear about. They're great gossip mongers. Talkback radio stars love them. They're all lies. None of them happen. Sorry, all except one happened. If you Google the Stella Awards, you'll actually find a great long list of them. Stella, S03, they're named after, and in fact that's one of the few cases where it was true. An old woman by the name of Stella went to McDonald's drive-through, she bought a coffee, she was in the passenger seat, she spilled the coffee, she scolded, she sued McDonald's for absolute millions. Have you heard that?
Yeah, I've heard it,
Yeah. And when you heard the story, did you hear that how utterly ridiculous the system is that someone could do that they were so stupid that they drove through and they spilled the coffee and they took no personal responsibility? Was that kind of the tone of the story?
Yeah.
Okay. Did anybody hear any other variations on that story?
Yes.
Yes?
And that she sued because the coffee that they gave her was above a certain degree that it should be, and it actually gave her a certain degree burns.
Yeah. The courts aren't that stupid that they would let somebody do something dumb like climb in the back of their Winnebago and win. Yes, somebody did apparently try to sue because Red Bull didn't give them wings. That doesn't mean they were successful. That means they went to court and the court said, "I'll go along." What happened to Stella is, she's quite a very old woman. She's the passenger in the car. She was handed the coffee at stupid hot temperature. That it did cause third-degree burns to this entire region when it spilled. I think she was a bit beyond childbirth years anyway, but you get the picture. She wouldn't have. She was a mess. Third-degree. There are photos on the internet. That was up. But this wasn't. Oops. It was slightly ouch. It was third-degree burns, and McDonald's offered to settle out of court, as they had done so a dozen times earlier that year. When it comes to could you reasonably predict this was going to happen, yes, it could, because they knew this was going to keep on happening. This all came out in court, that in fact cost her quite a lot, and the court made what we call punitive damages, something that would be a real punishment for McDonald's to stop them. It was in the tens of millions. But as they said, the way they came up with that set amount, in fact, I think she sued for a certain amount and the jury decided it should be more. Whatever the sum was in the tens of millions was the sum total of coffee sales by McDonald's for one day. So punishment, but it wasn't going to kill them. They're still around to this day. And in fact, they counter-sued and they got all their money back, and you know how the law works. As I was talking in an earlier class, McDonald's has lots and lots of money. She was an old lady, and she settled for a lot smaller amount, knowing that she would spend her remaining days
Fighting McDonald's.
fighting McDonald's in court. She'd already spent enough time and it had enough damages that it wasn't worth it. So the awards are named after what sounds like a very silly story when you first hear it, depending on who tells the story. It sounds that way. But in fact, there's a lot of rationale to it. Civil liability was that big an issue that they brought in specific legislation that was with that sort of thing. Civil Law Wrongs Act of 2002, I'm looking at the s03 website here, says that Good Samaritans are protected from liability. You'll see that part of the act there, this is the direct copy from the website, has got a hyperlink, it's underlined and it's in blue. You can click on that because part of how the acts work is they define what they mean by Good Samaritan. We'll get to that in a moment. Good Samaritan will not incur personal liability for an act done or an omission made honestly and without recklessness if they assist, give advice to a person who is or who appears to be, they have to be very careful with the way they word the laws. A person who appears to be injured or at risk of being injured or in need of emergency medical assistance unless it's already covered by third-party motor vehicle insurance, or if the Good Samaritan was significantly impaired by a recreational drug. So be very careful with the words, but that's the way it's worded. If English isn't your first language, my apologies, but you do need to be able to read the law, and that's the way the Good Samaritan's part happened in this case. They define Good Samaritan: a person who acts without expectation of payment, so not someone who's being paid to do this job, but comes to the aid of someone who's injured or in need of medical assistance, or a person who's medically qualified, who's not expecting to get paid, and they define medically qualified as a doctor. They go on with the definitions. So somebody who voluntarily does something along those lines is a Good Samaritan and therefore is protected. If you're doing it as part of your volunteer work for an organisation, we'll get to that in a moment, sorry.
It's like people who get sued for breaking ribs in CPR.
That's what it was afraid. That was the issue. Was people were afraid to go to the rescue of anybody because they were afraid that they were going to get sued. So they specifically made a law that says Good Samaritans, people who aren't paid, who aren't stoned or drunk, can go to the aid of someone who's injured or appears to be injured and does their best. Then they will not be sued for breaking the ribs or doing what they thought was the best thing to do at the time. Or a medical professional who you just heard the words. You're also protected if you're volunteering for a not-for-profit, but then, although you're protected, the organisation isn't. So it's another part of that act, because again, people are scared to volunteer for the organisations. Most not-for-profits, right up to the big ones like Mission Australia and Burnside, etc., they're actually the management of that. The very top is a bunch of people who don't get paid. So there's a definite period of struggle to find anybody to fill your management committee positions because they're not being paid, but they were feeling vulnerable of getting sued. It's like, no payment, but no, what sort of idiot would do a job like that? So people ran miles, organisations closed, the act trying to protect that. Okay, this might sound a bit ideal. We're going to prevent injuries whenever it's reasonably practical. Make sure you don't harm your neighbour in any place. But can we really prevent all injuries that we could possibly think of? Think of a couple of examples from industry. A young person decides, if you're a youth worker, might have issues like a young person deciding she wants to learn to ride a motorbike, but she might hurt herself falling on. So under perfect duty of care, we could reasonably predict that a young person riding a motorbike is going to injure him or herself, therefore we would stop them from doing that. Another example, sorry?
In our other class we learned that they have free will, so that...
They do, I'm getting to that.
That
should be a couple more slides.
Just check it.
Yes. Under perfect duty of care, there is something that balances that, which we'll get to in about 3 slides' time. Another example, elderly person wants to live in his own home rather than going to an aged care facility. Perfect duty of care would be saying, no, you might harm yourself, you might hurt yourself, something bad might happen. We're going to put you in an aged care home because we've got the power to do that. Or another example would be mildly disabled young adult, someone who's just a bit, anyway, moves into independent housing away from her family. That might be great for her, but if there's... I don't want it to just be about scared of being sued. Remember that's this trap we fall into of talking about the law? If we're concerned about our duty of care, then we could say, no, you're staying with your family because we can keep you safer that way. We don't want. Clearly, it's not just unworkable, it's actually really bad for our clients. Fourth example, a woman going back to a partner. You'll come across this a lot. there's a very high chance that she's going to get hurt sometime in the future. That's why she left him in the first place. But she's gone back to him. Perfect duty of care would be saying, let's take that freedom off her. Don't let that happen. The law recognises that's not in anybody's interest. It's not always ideal to be protected from making bad decisions, and it's known as the dignity at risk. And I told you 4 more slides. Dignity at risk is, no, I'm glad you've raised it because it was a really good point, and if you'd let me crap on and I didn't come back to this, then I think you would have been negligent not to mention it. Dignity at risk was actually something that came about through the disability sector. The disability sector in the past has been very keen to, or people have been very keen for disabled people to get locked up and institutionalised away from them. And it's part of what I love about the way society has changed in recent decades is they've said, no, we don't want to do that. And in fact, welfare workers, you lot, have helped them advocate for themselves and say, this isn't what we want. We want to have the dignity to make dumb decisions. We want to have the dignity to take some risks, make some bad decisions. Freedom to make mistakes, to make choices for ourselves, even if other people like caregivers or youth workers or parents or welfare workers think that the choice could cause a problem, a risk or an error. That's the dignity of risk. So the woman could return to her partner, the young woman could learn to ride the motorbike. We encourage borderline intellectually disabled people to set up homes for themselves and to learn what it is to be an adult. And that's really risky, and it's hard enough for parents in general. So it's hard. I get it, we want to do some caring, it's part of what's attracted us to this industry in the first place. But the dignity of risk is a balancing factor there. A few people were writing that, so I'll give you a few seconds longer.
As a worker,
Yep.
if your client comes up to you and says, I want to ride a bike and all of that,
Yep.
we being obligated to say, that's great, these are possible outcomes, but we'll support your needs.
So we still have a duty of care,
Yes.
but we're still allowing them to make bad decisions. Really dumb decisions sometimes, in my humble opinion. But that's where we balance it. That's where we say, okay, the duty of care that we have is to inform them of what's going on. So there are mentions in the various different codes of ethics, and there will be certainly parts of your organisation's policy that do that balancing, that basically say we'll make sure that we inform people as to what the risks are, but we'll still let them make a decision. So essentially what you just said, there's a space there where you want to be able to say it's your choice ultimately, but I do have a duty of care. I just want to make sure that you understand the risks that you're going in for. So we will frequently see, and it may be one of the stresses that you feel in your job, is you're frequently seeing people make dumb decisions. It's one of the hardest things in the world for people working in the women's refuge system, is they see constantly, they know that part of their training is knowing that women are saying, no, it's different. He said he's not going to do it anymore, and he bought me flowers. So they return to something that they know because they have seen it told before could easily be life-threatening. So the way they balance that is to say, okay, we do have a duty of care, so let's have a bit of a yarn. Very bushwhack of me, you guys don't say yarn. Let's have a discussion. Let's have a chat, if you like. So, what do you reckon the odds are that you're going to get injured in the next 6 months? And because everything is lovely now, I mentioned the flowers, I think, she may well say 1 in 10. Okay, 1 in 10, we can work with that. So, hopefully it'll be like you said, 9 out of 10. This is fantastic. That's cool. Let's make a plan just in case for that 10%. So just if that 10% does happen, to stop the damage being too bad, is there anything that you can do? And they'll have a safety plan. And that could involve any number of things. Anyone who's been a parent of a young child will know you tend to lug around a bag anyway that's got nappies and toys and mushy food and all sorts of stuff. So maybe part of that safety plan would be have some extra clothes in there anyway, maybe have a little bit of cash. Maybe a safety plan isn't going to be having a brochure that clearly says here's the contact details for a service, but maybe you have those numbers on a pen or tucked away somewhere else. Maybe you'll keep them inside one of your pads, because seriously guys don't poke around. You can do with that. So that's a good secret place to keep some dollars and some details. Maybe you've got a friend you can leave the keys with, maybe you'll have something in the car, maybe. And I'm saying with some young people, they've got a backpack that's there just for when mum or dad does drink too much, then I know I've got a friend I can go to, I can grab the back easily, it's got a change of clothes. It's got an old phone. Old phones can still ring 000 or 112. So it's still got a fully charged old phone, it's not in use anymore, tucked away. All of those sort of things. Still, people are making their own choices, but they're making allowance for that 1 in 10 chance that we might estimate as higher, but that's the way of balancing dignity and risk with duty of kids. Do you know where's a safe place? Do you know someone you can go to together? Do you have a plan? Just in case. Somebody have a comment?
I was just going to say that dignity of risk, that's not boy when that you need to say she had children as well, or
There is a limit to it. That's right, and as I did say, it's a balancing act, and that's essentially it. Is we still say if somebody, we don't say you've got the freedom to commit suicide, go right ahead. You've got the freedom to do something that we know, despite how intoxicated you are, to go down there and tell that neighbourhood or teach you. When we can see that there's a serious and imminent risk of harm, then we're going to say, and we want our clients to go in advance, if I can make a phone call to keep you safe because I think you're going to get seriously hurt, then I'm going to do that. So suicide is the classic for it, but other forms of immediate harm, and child protection is the other. Is if it's a child at risk of harm, we warn our clients in advance, more on this next week, but we warn our clients in advance that we are mandatory reporters, the law says it, and ethically we would have anyway. We want to keep your kids safe, so what can we do? So it's not balancing, it's not entirely dignity risk, it's not entirely duty of care. We find ways to still maintain both. The WHS has put this all into a legal act, an active act, because it's really, that's what WHS is all about, is you've got a duty to make sure you don't cause harm to other people while you're at work. This policy here, centre staff will check daily to make sure there's no needles, broken glass condoms or other hazards in the area with the park next to the property. So it's not actually something you've got control over. Some control. Nothing massive, but it's some control. Use of the collection tongs, etc. Workers should follow the policies. They'll often tell us to discuss the hazards they face, as we've said, and keep a record of it. That's the other key part in this whole thing, is write down. Marisha decided to leave and set up her own home with her abusive partner, riding a motorbike. And she's really old, whatever the other example. But we discussed, and here's what we put into place. So keep a record of it in case anybody does suggest that that never happened. Write it down, and if you've got an ethical decision worker, talk to a co-worker, talk to someone else. It's always good to share the load, to run that extra screen through. Sometimes it's just an ethical decision. 16-year-old comes to your youth service, he or she appears to be affected by alcohol. It's a he. Here's verbally abusive behaviour affects the other participants. Who have you got a duty of care towards? Who is your neighbour? What should you do? So let's start with who have you got a duty of care towards? Who could you reasonably predict would be affected by your decision? Everybody in the whole story. The other residents, but also the 16-year-old. You've still got a duty of care there. That's the actual take reasonable care to avoid acts of omissions. Choosing to do nothing doesn't work. You could even see some problems here. So, if you chose to do nothing, you're just skipping over the omissions part. If there's something you could reasonably predict was going to happen, and look, 16-year-old being verbally abusive, we could reasonably predict, yeah, this could get ugly. All of the people who could be affected, that's your neighbour, someone who could reasonably predict it to be affected or injured. So part 2 of that story would be, end of part 1 is you have a bit of a chat, discussion, but not yarn because I'm avoiding that word. And you discuss the policy, and so he hangs around outside the fence. Who do you have a duty of care towards now? Because he's outside the fence now. You have control. Do you have any control at all? It's an interesting question. Real reasonable acts. You've actually got less power to do anything. So the duty of care shifts. The more power you've got, the stronger your duty of care. But in this case, you've got a little bit less power. But that doesn't mean it's gone. You've still got some power, so it's still there. You might focus on keeping the other clients safe. You might, because you've got more power over them than him. Sorry, I had a question.
So I was going to say, for example, saying like that whole group I was there, the workers need to go on morning and check park needs and everything. Therefore, he's still in that zone. That would be considerate of outside neighbours to the organisation.
You've got it. The ultimate power might lie with someone else, but you've still got some power. Therefore, you're doing what you can. You might have the power to call a taxi or someone else that could keep him safe. Many people here have got a responsible service of alcohol ticket. There's usually a few. Did you get taught anything then about your duty of care to drunk patrons as they're leaving? What's your duty of care in those cases? Paul?
Well, I guess, for example, the last time I had to remove something from the bar, security helped. They were then hanging outside. They started to bang on the window, disturbing people inside, trying to incite violence. So we just called the police. Didn't make a report, just asked them to take them home.
Okay.
The police came and did.
That's someone who's violent. What about if they're not violent, they're just struggling to walk? Did you hear anything then in your course about duty of care? I have heard other students say, we were told that we still have a duty of care for them until they reach a home. Not necessarily their own home.
You have to,
Visiting a friend.
you have to call, ask them for a phone number, if they have friends to pick them up, or hire a taxi for them.
So calling a taxi, calling a friend, then you're balancing those issues. But if you could reasonably predict that this person is clearly that drunk, not pointing at anybody here, but this person is clearly that drunk that there's a very good chance, I could reasonably predict that they're going to fall in front of a car, then I've got a duty of care because I've got some power to call a taxi or call a friend or do something to keep them safe. Or to not give them that much in the first place has also been part of the whole system.
Sometimes they turn up drunk though.
Sometimes they do. There's limits. I'm not pretending that, but you've got power to do some things. I haven't got a responsible service of alcohol ticket, but they tell me that that's the way they treat it is. Until you reach a home, you've got responsibilities. So what could you reasonably predict? What can you reasonably do, still allowing them some freedom there? Another example would be if you're taking a group of young people abseiling, some of the issues you need to consider, thinking about getting appropriate licensing. I don't know that there is necessarily a licence for that, so therefore getting appropriate people. Sometimes you need to balance it. I will discuss that with you next week, but I'd like you to go and think about times, even in your day-to-day life, let alone your work life, we need to balance duty of care with dignity of risk. How do we balance that? it's actually a lot more day to day than I've got a duty of care to my daughter. She's just got a driver's license and a car. I'm giving her the dignity of risk, but I'm also still got duties, that sort of thing. It still counts, not just in your work life, but throughout.